Thank you so much for having me here today. We're going to go ahead and jump right in so we can get to this great panel. And what I'm going to ask them all to do is just take a moment very quickly and introduce themselves. So I don't think I can kind of do them justice. So they'll talk about who they are and what they're interested in, and then we'll go straight into questions. Jake, we'll start with you.
All right. Hi, everyone. It's a huge honor to be here. I'm Jake Porway. I work at DataKind. We are a nonprofit dedicated to using data science in the service of humanity, which in the short term basically means you can think of us like Doctors Without Borders for data geeks. So if you're bored working at Facebook helping people click ads, we'll team you up with anything from a small nonprofit to a big organization to help them understand data science. So, for example, we worked with a small nonprofit in DC looking at child well-being who said, great, there's all this new open government data about child well-being. We don't know how to use Excel. What do we do with that? So we teamed them up with data scientists to build new interactives and analyze the data to help policymakers understand child well-being. But we also work with big groups, like the World Bank said, hey, we do poverty analysis, and it requires us to go around and do a census and get people with clipboards to understand what poverty looks like in a country, and it takes 5 years, and you get one number that says Uganda's 86 poor, and how do you make policy around that? So they teamed up with people and data scientists who helped them scrape food prices, helped them look at illumination data from satellite imagery to get more real-time analysis of poverty that they're now using to drive policy. So it's super exciting stuff. It's really fun, and we're just excited to see new ways that these cross-community collaborations can help use data science to solve some of the world's biggest problems. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. I'm Anika Jimenez. I'm the Global Head of Data Science Services at Pivotal. Pivotal is actually a spin-out that we launched in April that is coming out of EMC and VMware with a 10% ownership stake from GE as well. We are a big data startup, about 1,800 employees strong, that are combining cloud technologies, distributed computing technologies, and app technologies into a single integrated platform. I happen to have the honor of leading what I consider to be the world's best data science team. That means that we're actually doing work across just about any sector that you can imagine, deep, meaningful data science work, bringing in machine learning and predictive modeling onto our distributed computing stack. We see ourselves as kind of the connective tissue between bringing data together with apps. And you'll see us talk more and more about that into the future.
Thanks. Mike?
My name is Mike Flowers. Sorry about that. I'm the Chief Analytics Officer for the City of New York. Much less glamorous work than my colleagues on this panel. What we do is take the information that the city collects on a day-to-day basis and use it to allocate our resources without raising taxes. And that means we do that to get better at picking up your trash, or licensing your business, or responding to your emergency, or ensuring that when a storm hits, you're safe. So these are very nuts and bolts things that we as a city deliver. We're not the state, we're not the feds. That we found we could leverage the information we have, and not just data, but the information, to get those resources to the worst the first, and then fan out accordingly. It's been extraordinarily effective, it's been extraordinarily cost-effective, as well as providing public safety value, economic development value, sustainability value, and it, in our view, is something that really is the direction that local governments need to go.
I'm Dave McQueenie, here from IBM Research. Before heading back to research, I spent several years down here in Washington as our federal CTO, and I always enjoy the excuse to come back down here to Washington to participate in one of the events. As you probably all know, IBM's been around for a while. We're just over 100 years old, and I would say by any definition, we've been at the forefront of big data and analytics for that entire 100 years. Now, we didn't call it that until recently, but for the whole time span of our company, going back literally to mechanical tabulating machines and punched cards that could count and sort things, we've always been at whatever the cutting edge was of the largest data sets you could accumulate and manipulate, the most prodigious computing resources that could be assembled. And so to us, what's exciting about this era that we're talking about now is that the span of applications we have, the number of data sources we have, the power of big data and analytics can now be put into the hands of the smallest companies, the small departments inside of federal agencies. It's not just the purview of the very large companies and the very large government agencies. Sources of data are everywhere. Sensors and actuators go all the way to the edge of physical processes, so things that weren't ever virtualized before can be virtualized now. We can make perfect digital replicas of many, many different physical ecosystems and effectively put them inside a digital feedback loop. So the explosion of the ability of these data and computational sciences to impact everything, I think, is the most exciting thing that we're all here talking about today. The other reason that we're here is we think that, as many of the other panelists you've heard from before have expressed, this is an intensely collaborative kind of a business. It crosses disciplines, it crosses agencies, it crosses different kinds of companies with different missions, and it has a tremendous ability to collaborate with academic institutions. We have well over 1,000 universities that we're partnered with and collaborating with on meaningful projects in this space, and we always look forward to creating more. And I'll be making some comments later as we go through the Q&A about some tools we're developing to help guide and steer students into the emerging areas around data science, because we know that in any case with young students, we're competing with other fields to attract their attention. We want to make the best case to show them that these fields are exciting and interesting and impactful, and help to give the students tools to evaluate what they need to do to go after these most interesting, we think, of the new careers.
Hi, my name is Dana Boyd, and I'm a principal researcher at Microsoft Research, and I'm also a part of the team that's putting together a Council for Big Data Ethics in Society. And one of the things that we've been talking about is that those of us from more of the humanistic and social science persuasions realize that there's a lot of conversations that need to happen between the computational world and the social science communities. And for better or worse, these end up getting sliced disciplinarily. So we end up seeing the conversations around privacy happening in the law schools, the conversations around ethics happening in some of the philosophical communities, but we don't see them actually being in conversation. And I think that as we start to think about the cross-disciplinary possibilities that really happen because of a lot of data science initiatives, there's so much need to have these conversations collected and brought together. And so what we're hoping to do is bring together all of the communities that are really thinking through the hard ethical, social, legal, policy issues in conversation with those who are really advancing some of the computational possibilities, and realizing that we can work together. That actually it's not about fighting between whether or not privacy is good or privacy is bad, but finding ways to really sort of walk that tightrope and do things that are both ethical and really innovative.
Great, thanks. So as you can see, our panel really kind of crosses, government and nonprofits and private companies. So I think let's start off by talking about how are the approaches to big data different for these organizations? What do you see? Who wants to jump in?
Well, I mean, I think just from a pivotal perspective, we were built from the ground up to deal with like the true kind of large volumes of big data, bringing kind of our massively parallel processing database technologies and integrating that into Hadoop, et cetera. So when we're working with customers, when my data science team is working directly with customers, we're actually taking data that they've been curating over years, and we're beginning to help them ask and answer the questions that have been their burning questions and just haven't had the distributed computing stack to be able to process through those large volumes of data. So when I go out and speak in public, I usually make a point of defining data science as being tied to the bigness of data, because I see it as a direct corollary to big data. That means that the tools need to evolve to support that, and the analytical infrastructure needs to evolve to support that as well. That's kind of just from a vendor perspective, of course, which will be very different from the rest of the folks on the panel.
So from a local government standpoint, and I keep stressing the local part of it. Yeah, we're New York, and we're huge, but we're still a local government. And the challenges can be bucketed, cultural, legal, political, and technological/technical. And that I put technological/technical last because that's the easy one. Thanks, and I'm not saying it was easy to get there. What I'm saying is thanks in large part to the people in this room and their colleagues and confederates. The tools are there. The barriers to entry from a pure engineering standpoint, can we do this? Can we glean insight from that which previously we could not? It's been answered, and we can. So the challenges from a local government standpoint are cultural, legal, and political. The legal range from the fact that an ambulance goes to your house, that's a HIPAA transaction, right? $40,000 fine, I think, and we have 20,000 of those a day. We'd be bankrupt in a week if we used it the wrong way. Tax secrecy, et cetera. But, you know, and then the cultural and political parts, I happen to be blessed with the best boss I've ever had in my life. And it was based on the fact that I went to him with an idea. He said, prove it. We proved it, and then he backed it. And that's the way it had to work. So we had great top-down support. And then culturally speaking, this is the really interesting one, because at the time I got started, I didn't realize that I was going to have to create a market for our product. But that's what we ended up doing by focusing on the excellence of the product, as well as a small footprint approach to existing logistics, which is, you know, wonk speak for, you know, when you say that the Department of Buildings has to go out and do an inspection, what that means is somebody calls 311, that the 311 operator does a triage, reads a script, a predetermined script to determine what kind of problem it is. It goes into the building information system that is resident of the Department of Buildings. And then Marjorie in Queens on Tuesday hits print, and it goes to 7 guys who go out and do field inspections for their particular neighborhood area, right? So anything we came up with that disrupted that was never going to go anywhere. So we had to understand culturally how those services are surfaced on the ground in order to get the wonderful insight that my team was able to glean. And that insight is real. We do know, for example, that if a property has a foreclosure or a tax lien on it, that it has a very statistically significant relationship with whether or not that place is going to have a fire. I don't know if it's got cause of anything to do with it. I doubt it sincerely, but I know that we know that, and we are now obligated ethically and morally to act on that. So those challenges, considering the widget that our local government delivers, are what we faced, right? So it's a different perspective, I think, than some of my fellow panelists. But I want to note for one thing, these are also very common challenges. I don't care if you're in government, you're picking up trash, or you're trying to sell somebody a product. If you don't understand the humanity and the processes behind the data you're looking at, then you're just going to go off the rails, and you're never going to produce anything worthwhile, which is why your comment about the humanities element resonated so much.
So I kind of want to add on, oh, sorry. I can't tell who's on that side about to speak. It's like a little mirror.
Jake, you want to add something, and then Dana?
Yeah, if you don't mind. So I love what Annika said about needing new technologies, and Mike saying that you need to understand what behaviors come out of this. But often when we have these talks, we talk about these huge, hulking big data systems and data coming off satellites and how it integrates with healthcare, and they're huge and amazing, and that's all true. But to me, one of the cool things about that big data is that it's expansive. And one of the new things that we're seeing is that everyone is being touched by it. It's not just those giant silos of data. So look at the international development community. Increasingly, organizations are using cell phones to deliver goods. Say, you can bring text your symptoms into a doctor, or you can use mobile money. That is a huge change, because that now means that those services all create data, beautiful data that you can use. And I don't care if it's 100 gigs or 100 megs, if you are a small clean water NGO without statistical or computing abilities, you're not going to be able to take advantage of that, right? Like, you can't learn from that the way that we use these new technologies in the biggest sense as well. So what's exciting to me is seeing this whole new realm of people who are stepping into the world of needing to understand data. Just as in the 90s, everyone had to sort of start to learn about computing, like everyone had its kind of computing moment. Now everyone is starting to take part in this conversation and needs those skills. So to me, the new aspect of big data is bringing all of these people up to the level of being able to ask the right questions, use the right tools, and even just knowing what they don't know. So that's, obviously my own personal bias in this, but I think that to me what is so exciting is everyone becoming part of the big data conversation.
I think another thing to keep in mind is that there's actually a technological shift that's part of this conversation, not just in terms of capacity to deal with larger data, but in terms of how data is organized. Historically, you had to really think through how you were going to architect your databases in order to save and store all of the data that we were talking about. With many of the new kinds of technologies that we're seeing, you just pour the data in, right? And it's a little messier than that, but part of that process is then you have this data and you can run different kinds of queries across it that result in seeing correlations that may not actually make sense, that result in having data doing strange things, that if you don't know how to ask those hard questions and you don't know how to interpret what comes out, there can be a lot of misunderstanding that goes on in light of data. It also creates these interesting challenges because you see more and more people being like, if we just get all of the data, it will solve all of our problems. And of course, that's not actually how this works. And I think that one of the challenges that we face in figuring this out is that we have these technological shifts that are magical, but we also have to think about the mindset shifts that come with it so that the two can be synergistic to really address these problems.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, this set of responses is interesting because it highlights the human cultural aspects. Michael talked about, we're past the point of wondering whether it works. We know it works. Now the question is, how can we use it? And one of the things that we discovered when we were putting together an assessment tool to help students, guide themselves toward the kind of expertise and the kind of capability that was needed here is you tend to start out with, can you do abstract reasoning? Can you do logical reasoning? And all the things you might expect would go into a data scientist. And you very, very quickly learn that there's a different kind of a decision-making process you have to become comfortable with. You have to understand whether things are statistically significant or not. How do you handle situations where the data is telling you something that goes against the common understanding or your human instinct? And so there's actually a bit of a different decision-making process. And one of the most interesting aspects of the assessment tool that we put together was some input from a company called Connexa that's a relatively recent acquisition by IBM that connects the world of how humans work together, how we collaborate, what kind of experience and background are likely to lead to success on different kinds of technical engagements. And so crossing this element of how humans work on things, how humans think and interact with each other, and their individual characteristics, I think we all know in our gut that team composition can be magic or not magic depending on a group of people getting together. And you can actually be a little bit more deliberate about that. And what it tells you is, as you assess the likelihood of someone being successful as a data scientist, you can actually start asking questions like, are they willing to adopt a very different kind of a decision process and actually stand by their convictions even when it goes slightly against the conventional wisdom? Because that leads you to the kind of breakthroughs that I think are most interesting.
Yeah, I think we should talk a little bit more about that workforce. One of the things that strikes me is that you need people who are skilled in understanding, right, and as you say, willing to kind of look at the data and pull the right insight from it. But I mean, Jake, you're pairing people who have no background in certain things with a nonprofit. I mean, do you need an expertise in your subject to be able to make use of that data?
Oh, I think absolutely. One of the things that frustrates me most is seeing people believe that the technologists hold the answers. And if we just open up enough data or have enough hackathons, like they'll show us what to do with it. Like, I'm a data scientist. I don't know the first thing about poverty alleviation. As Mike was saying, I don't know the behaviors of the field agents on the ground. So I can make the coolest visualization in the world, but if I don't know how someone's going to use it or why, then it's totally worthless. It's just going to go on a blog. So I think that's super important that you get subject matter experts together with data scientists to figure out what they can do together. But I need to also call out that the reason that we're here actually is that in doing this, you need really good data scientists, which are still very rare. It's rare to find people who have the combination of computer science and statistical skills, but also that sort of critical ability to ask questions, so that if you are, say, paired up with an NGO, you can push them further to say, hey, how are you going to use this? Will this actually get you where you're going? And the reason that we're here is that we're teaming up with Pivotal for a program called Pivotal for Good, where they'll be donating a senior data scientist to give 3 months of their time to work on these projects, so that we now know if we've got someone who's really making an impact in the world or the country, like, say, the Red Cross, we have access to people who can really help them work together to make a difference. And so I think it's really having strength on both sides around that, and I'm very excited that we're seeing more of those collaborations happen.
Yeah, and we, of course, Pivotal is really excited to be partnering with DataKind for the same reason. And for us, the intent is to take these very passionate problem solvers, and once they've been with Pivotal for about 3 years, give them the ability to do the great work that they're doing, but targeted towards organizations that don't have the ability to compete in the job market in the same way that I do with my pre-IPO options. Right, so so that gives me a lot of strength in terms of the skill set, but we want to have an impact more broadly, not just within the enterprise sector. When I'm out talking, I usually bring up this concept of a data science value chain, and I think we're at a point right now where it's no longer this kind of little bit overused phrase of asking the right questions. It's actually, once we give you the answers, what are you going to do about it, is the question that I would pose. And very frequently what that means is the organization and the culture, to Mike's earlier point, hasn't shifted enough to be ready to consume these very significant, predictive, very frequently insights in such a way that their entire mechanisms for reaching out to their customer base or to their services or their manufacturing processes, which are all of their applications, actually now need to consume from these insights and change the way that they're behaving as a result. So that's an indication of really highlighting the need for the domain experts, which typically sit close to applications, with the data science problem solvers to unlock these new ways to action on data, not just throw up the insights that come out of processing through large amounts of data.
Mm-hmm. And in many ways, it's these insights that actually cause the transformations within sectors that become really challenging. Because when you see communities be really resistant to the kinds of insights that are found, then we start to run into a whole set of different kinds of problems. So as an example, I've been working with a variety of different organizations that have been looking for data patterns that indicate human trafficking, right? And actually, we can start to see this within the financial sector in really, really powerful ways. But when you start to flood law enforcement with this information, they don't necessarily know how to deal with it. And so you run into these challenges where we can actually start to use these powerful tools, but if we haven't set up all of the mechanisms to deal with those insights, we don't necessarily address the fundamental problem that we're seeking to address.
Mike, how do you deal with that?
Because we're problem-driven. I have no background in science and technology or statistics. I'm an attorney. I was a prosecutor. So, it's sort of a different way of approaching things. Case comes to you, deconstruct a case. Why did they do it? Did we have the right guy? How do I present the evidence in a way that make 12 strangers agree with me in New York? So that's the approach that I took towards leveraging data science, and it's been extraordinarily effective. But it's been extraordinarily effective because it's tailored to the context in which I'm applying it, right? And what I'm trying to say is, I think, to Jake's point and a couple of other points that were made, if I were to go out to the field, the actual field level, and go to a fire inspector or even a consumer affairs inspector or whatever, right, and say, yeah, I hired these kids, and they're going to tell you how to do your job. They'll look at them the same way they look at, like, McKinsey when they show up, right? And maybe a little more disdainfully, who knows? But the reality is that we have to sit there and figure out a way to understand that people are going to be acting on this insight and then tailor it accordingly. So I actually have not run into the problem of coming up with an insight that nobody wants or will use, because what I go looking for is based on what the client wants. The clients of the agencies. What do we do? How do we? What services do we as a city deliver? We fight fire. We respond to crimes. We license businesses. We collect taxes. We educate kids, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We provide human services. And those people that are on the ground facing those problems craft how I go about attacking that problem, rather than I think we can be better.
Right.
Yeah, the comment I would make to bridge to the prior panel where we had the discussion from the academic partners along with the two foundations, it wasn't so long ago that you couldn't get a degree in computer science. Many of the people in the room have been around long enough to remember when that was born as a discipline. And that's a very broad discipline. It goes almost to mathematics at one end and almost to circuit design on the other end. And all of the computer science departments that exist in universities today probably trace their lineage to either the mathematics or the electrical engineering department. And so I loved hearing the academic folks on the prior panel talk about how they've clearly recognized this. They've seen this movie before, and are you going to create tenure-track positions? Can you get grant proposals funded? Is this recognized as a discipline in its own right? And I think it's it's exactly the right way to look at it, and it's a terrific bridge between the conversation we're having and the conversation that they had before.
Right. Is there a larger kind of cultural shift, though, that has to happen? Dana, maybe you can speak to there obviously have been some events this summer that have made people say, what kind of data is being collected? What should I know about what's happening?
I mean, certainly the summer of surveillance has created a lot of complications for a lot of people, many of whom are probably in this room. And I think that's where we have to figure out how to develop these fine lines and how to address them in really ethical and responsible ways. And I guess one of the examples that I would give here is I actually have to commend the National Institute of Health for dealing with this in one particular domain. So one of the issues that they've dealt with is that for a long time, scientists have been using HeLa cells, which are actually based on Henrietta Lacks DNA. And they've been doing amazing amounts of research that has been absolutely phenomenal. But one of the things that started to emerge is that the descendants of the original woman sort of raised their hand and wait, you're predicting my health and you're doing it in a public way. And wait, I'm not okay with that. And the NIH responded to this and said, actually, that's a really important issue to be addressed. And they actually started to bring in members of the family to be a part of the conversation. And that's actually why I think that these cultural issues that are going to happen are not just what we can do once we get access to data or once we get access to scientific matter, but where we figure out how to bring in the relevant constituencies to make certain that they're part of a conversation. And that's certainly going to have to be how we get through even the questions of the summer of surveillance. It's going to be how we get through a lot of the data science challenges that we're going to be dealing with, is who are the right players, who are being affected by this, and how do we make certain that everybody has a voice in the room in a really meaningful way.
Jake, can you speak to how nonprofits feel about this? I mean, are they facing the same challenges of they don't know what they're looking for, or they don't necessarily know how to implement what the findings are?
Yeah, I can speak to that. Before I do, I just have to say, Dana just said the best thing ever. I'm just so excited by that. I just want to point out that it's such a nuanced view of what we do in light of this new era of data. And so many conversations I've been hearing have been so polarizing. It's either, we got to shut this down, we got to stop the government from watching our data, get companies to stop collecting our data, or completely to the other side of just malaise, or if I'm not doing anything wrong, then I shouldn't worry about it. And I love that thank God someone is holding up the torch of a nuanced conversation of what kind of world do we want to live in and how do we get constituent partners involved. So I just wanted to plus one that. I thought that was great. And I'll just say briefly about nonprofits. I think there's less, at least, there's a big world of nonprofits, so right, they don't all fit into the same bucket. But I think right now what I'm seeing a cultural shift in is a fear of letting data out. There's more of a confusion about what could happen with data. They realize that they are charged with a responsibility of holding very personal data. For example, people's income levels or poverty around the world. There's a real ethical issue there. And yet a lot of people are also clamoring to say if you let some of that data out, if you were to team up with other people looking around the same issue area, we could do great things together. But it's a very difficult thing to do because the culture, certainly in nonprofits at least, is to at least right now, it feels like it punishes you if you don't do well, if you don't use your money right, if you don't show that you are efficient. And there's a lot of fear that opening that data might let skeletons out of the closet, might lose you your funding, and that's really all you have to go on. And so I am actually very excited about the people and foundations in particular who play the role in recasting the culture of data sharing as something innovative, something to be heralded, and to hold up the shining examples of groups that have brought open that data to tackle problems together, as opposed to punishing people for opening their data and then saying, well, actually you didn't allocate your funds as well as we thought, so you don't exist anymore. So that's how I want to speak to that.
Yeah, and I just want to add on to that a little bit because I think there's a very significant shift happening in the enterprise sector, which is that companies are moving from whatever the core competency was that allowed for the origins of that company to realizing now that going forward, comparative advantage is actually going to be based on how efficiently and well they're leveraging their data, right? Soup to nuts, meaning how are they actually instrumenting for data capture? How are they storing and managing that data? How are they enabling it for insights? And then the connective tissue into the apps for actioning, right? So that's going to now be the source of kind of core competency for many companies in many sectors. And I think it's going to be no different in the nonprofit world. And so a lot of the the angst and kind of the struggles that some of the leaderships of nonprofit and enterprise are having with these very kind of maybe even existential questions about how to use data and the right ways to use data to honor consumers or individuals, et cetera, in the right way, we're still so at ground zero for navigating those decisions. And I think that's why a lot of these new efforts to address those questions and elevate them for public discussions are very, very important and meaningful. But a lot of that angst is the reflection of a very important shift that we're just beginning the start of that holds equally for the nonprofit sector as it does for the private enterprise sector.
Obviously one of the reasons we're here is to talk about partnerships. We've talked to you a little bit about where are the opportunities for partnership, where are you all looking? Obviously you're looking to each other. Dave, you're looking to academia?
We have a tremendous number of relationships with academic institutions for one reason, the obvious reason, which is a source of new talent, the people that we hire around our company. We do a lot of joint research. In fact, the only way we will get engaged in a funding relationship with the university is if we're actually doing collaborative work. We vote with our feet, and we invest where we're collaborating, and so many of the ideas we're talking about here born in the university world and can be worked on collaboratively between universities and industry, and it's the way to set up that pipeline to start creating this, this new discipline and this new set of skills that we've all been referencing today.
If I can just comment, because I think that's a really good point. From our perspective, we're always looking for partners, but our partners range from the 8.5 million New Yorkers to, the academic sector. The earlier presenter had a shot up of a Venn diagram created by a very close friend of mine named Drew Conway, and Drew had a hand in founding DataKind, and he also runs something called Data Gotham, which, aside from having like the coolest logo, is really just this kind of community of data scientists in New York City. And I just called him up and I was like, I need some help. Can you come in and give us a couple days a week to give us a hand as we get a little more robust in our analyses now that the market's there? And he jumped right at it. And that's actually a segue for us to get to the three main areas in New York City that the administration has been trying to engage so aggressively over the last dozen years. One is the academic sector. We just built broke ground on a new school. We're very proud of that. And we also had some pre-existing schools that were pretty damn good. NYU, Columbia, and CUNY. I don't want to leave them out because I think they're fantastic. And then there's the nonprofit crowd like Jake and Code for America and Hack New York and a number of other places. People who are like data activists. At the end of the day, we really listen to them. We may not listen with the alacrity they want, but we do hear them, and they highlight problems with our data. We're the government. We have to put our data out. We have a statute that says we got to put it out. So we put it out, and then they look at it and tell us what's crap and what's not, and then we know where to fix. And then finally, like I said, those 8.5 million New Yorkers are significant sources of intelligence for us, both in their 301 calls and 911 calls. But also the social media aspect, which I think runs two risks. The first risk is the government creepy problem, right? Like, let me monitor you on Twitter and then figure out what to do. There are a number of things you can do with that I think that are perfectly fine optically, but there's other things that I think make people a little leery, and we certainly have to be careful about that. So we're trying to strike a balance. But the other thing is, how good it is. And I don't mean the quality of the data, I mean the breadth of the insight. If I looked at Foursquare only to figure out where to send my hurricane recovery resources, Times Square would probably be built 12 times over and the Rockaways would be empty. And I don't know that many 80-year-olds with smartphones. So the fact that, I can only speak to my grandmother, and she doesn't. So the reality is, while I think there's a lot of value in social media, a lot of value for that municipal entities can leverage to do better at what they do, I hold it at arm's length right now, in part because there's absolutely not near the breadth that we would need to serve the underprivileged communities that we serve on top of the very privileged communities.
Yeah, I wanted to just comment further a little bit on our partnership because I think it's an interesting example of what's needed for success, right? So, the role that DataKind is playing for Pivotal in the Pivotal for Good program is to actually be an intermediary and an arbiter between our people and the nonprofits or the government agencies with which we could start doing some collaborations, right? So the intent is, almost to serve as kind of this really important engagement management function, which ensures that the entity is ready for data science, that there's data that is there to be worked with, and not just that, but the leadership team is going to actually, do something with the work that comes out of the process and is committed to the effort that is at hand, right? So it's an interesting commentary on kind of what's required at the project level for success. That for us to feel like we would be successful with Pivotal for Good, we really needed the support of a DataKind to kind of help be that intermediary to then link knowledge and need.
I have to bring you around for PR from now on. That was great. But I do want to say, I think Annika's exactly right. We get called a nonprofit because we are, because we thought people would be more likely to give us data if we were. But we do see ourselves as conveners, right? And so now, this is really the broader appeal, is that you've got the data science talents of Pivotal and the industry world. We are playing translation about how that's useful to certain nonprofits, sure, but it's everyone here. Like, I think everyone in this room wants to solve the same problems, right? Like, you want to get rid of poverty? Yeah, me too. Like, let's get cleaner water, better education. I think we're all here for that. So I think there's a place at the table for everyone here, and I actually say more than just hearing that feeling good. Like, come talk to us. Like, we need governments helping us inform the situation on the ground, like what Mike knows. We need nonprofits, sure. We need developers. We need everyone as part of this conversation. So I would just add on to say that the partnership extends beyond just two little groups to really everyone who's here. Yeah.
And building off what Jake said, I think that one of the things that's so phenomenal about what's going on is that we're quickly realizing that a lot of the issues are not sector specific. And so all of a sudden, the health sector has something to learn from the physicists, have something to learn from the nonprofit world. And there's these moments where we're starting to see a reconstruction of who gets to talk to who and how we can actually think about solving the problems together. And we're certainly seeing this within the academic communities where historically we were really, divided by discipline. And of course, there's still much to be done to sort of reorganize that. But I think that there's so much potential and opportunity, and I'm amazed by all of the different groups that are a part of today, because you're really seeing people try to cross through these historically divided lines across sectors, across disciplines, and across, frankly, like government agencies and organizations.
Kind of keeps coming up, the idea of getting data, not only just getting it to it, but getting the right data. Is that easier than it was in the past? Is that getting easier?
For us, it is.
Why is that?
Significantly easier, in part thanks to there's this data activist community in New York City that aggressively, they're small but very vocal, and they pushed very hard for New York City to turn its open data project into a statutory obligation. And that had, I don't know if that was their intended effect, but what it ended up doing in a lot of ways was kind of making it a lot easier to grab things from people because they can no longer argue that they can't give it to me because it's sensitive, because it's covered by the open data law. So, it was a great tool for me to go out and, data wrangle from all the agencies, because I'm like, look, you got a statute, you got to put this out anyway. It certainly made it a lot easier for us to go out and do what we needed to do.
But to Mike's earlier point, I think that part of the challenge is that certain kinds of data are much more accessible and certain kinds aren't. And we start to see questions of inequality and questions of who's not represented within data sets, or where there are biases within data sets. And I think that's where it becomes difficult, is just because a lot more data is available and there's certain kinds of data that are available, we also have to question who's not represented, who's not in the data, what kinds of data aren't available, and think through that complexity. And I think that we often forget that in light of so much available data.
Totally, and I think the politics around what we open is really interesting too. We treat all open data as equal, but you look at, say, the censuses that the government puts out, which a lot of community foundations use, are being scaled back, and saying, oh, but we're opening more data, but a lot of that data is about where potholes are. They're very different uses, right? Different amounts of usefulness to that type of data. So I think Or similarly, like the 401k data got opened up, but just because Brightscope, the company, was able to start a business off of it. So I think the politics around what types of data are opened and who's going to find them useful are not really being talked about as much and are really critical to this conversation.
Yeah, and I mean, from a data science perspective, obviously, you know, we would emphasize at that point kind of the one V of the big data, which is variety, right? So if data is opened up, we're very frequently, even within my group, actively using that in our modeling efforts, but we're combining that with proprietary data that the enterprise has curated over time, right? So it enables a new set of insights because we're marrying the knowledge and the logic that we're getting out of the open data with what might be proprietary internally within that company. So that it kind of unlocks even further potential in that respect. I think the other key element here is when it comes to instrumentation for data capture, we are on the cusp of the next big wave of big data, which is sensor-driven, the Internet of Things, right? So I come from Yahoo, where I think that maybe arguably one of the first waves of big data came out of weblogs, and there was a whole discipline around data science that emerged into how we were consuming weblogs and then later search and social data. For problem solving within the digital world. Now we're moving into the physical world, and we're now able to instrument for data capture in the physical way that is very, very fundamentally very meaningful to many companies operating in the space of, you know, machinery and widgets, et cetera. So, you know, the availability of data is really, I think, from our perspective, not so much the issue. It's really having the platforms to process the huge volumes of data that are coming upon us even now.
How will that sort of shift the industry or the field? Is that, I mean, do data scientists need to operate differently with that kind of data? Well,
there's different types of analytical problem solving that's going to introduce, but it's this, from a process perspective, the process is similar, right? And how we would engage with customers and help them refine the focus of their problem solving, making sure that there's actioning that's going to happen on the tail end of that, making sure the data is landing in a single place as opposed to silos across the organization. You know, all of those same tenets that we were working on now with the more traditional data sources would hold just as much in this new paradigm as well.
I think that, you know, so this sort of growing awareness of the data that's out there, you would think that would sort of build a workforce. Are you finding that students are interested in this, that this is a field that students are aware of?
Oh yeah, that's where the money is.
And you can do a lot of creative things to get students fired up. You can put out different kinds of challenges. We've heard several of them referenced here in the discussions previously. We've done several of them. You know, get the students engaged, get them to see what's possible, get them to see what they can do by themselves, how much power they can derive from especially large public sources of data like the ones in New York City or the ones that the federal government has worked so hard to put out. You know, one of the examples I think is really interesting is the work the Forest Service does to update the tree inventory for the United States. You know, how many trees are there, which species? You know, this is useful for all kinds of things like assessing the health of the ecosystem, you know, looking at what are safe levels of tree harvesting for commercial logging. And without an agency like that conducting that survey in a fair amount of detail, there's all kinds of other analysis combined with other data sources that wouldn't be possible. That background data almost has to come from a source like the Forest Service, and then dozens or hundreds of other analyses become possible by overlaying other data sources on top of that. And that's also where a lot of the predictive power comes from, is combining different data sources. Just like a scientist trying to find a signal that might be buried in noise, what's the scientist going to do? They're going to find as many different sources as they possibly can where the noise is uncorrelated, combine the data, and hopefully they can see through that noise to that tiny signal. And that gives a lot of really interesting insights into things like disease outbreaks and you know, different kinds of failure modes that equipment could have that wouldn't be visible from any one data set.
Right.
So just on the academic point, right? So we're a big hirer or employer of data scientists. So and we're employing data scientists to be able to plug into any sector that you know you could imagine now, inclusive of the nonprofit world. And I think, you know, as a result, we've gotten to know many of the academic programs out there that are focused on data science in one way or the other through certifications, maybe a master's program, et cetera. And it's really interesting from my vantage point to see just how all over the map these programs really are, right? So from my perspective, I'm looking for somebody with very strong programming skills and very sophisticated statistical and analytical understanding, and who is actively trying to bring those two disciplines together. I see programs that are focused on information sciences. I see programs that might be more focused on stats at the kind of the expense of the computer science part of the equation. I see programs that really reflect the legacy of the academic institution that is bringing those programs to market, right? And so, there needs to be still, I think, a further focus on really building the right best-in-class academic programs that give me the candidate pool that makes me very excited of knowing and the confidence that I can build it for the companies that we support.
And Dana, maybe you can talk about sort of the limitations on the data that these kind of next generation of data scientists are going to encounter. Are there ways that they can bring in perhaps this underrepresented data or information we're just not getting?
I mean, I think that there's a lot of exploration happening, and I think this is where we're really just at the beginning of it. But that's actually where I would say that the critical disciplines are actually a really important part of this. It's not just computer science and statistics, but it's actually the ability to ask the hard questions of the data that you have available to you. Do you even realize that you're missing data? Do you realize that, we all talk in a data world about having to clean the data and what biases get, baked in the process of cleaning, what biases get baked in the questions of how you're querying the data. Those hard ways of thinking are really critical to this process as well. And I think that that's where the more that you have people understanding the kinds of data that are available or what's happening, the more you'll start to see people asking hard questions of it. Even in terms of what government data is available. I know that the city of New York ran into a lot of challenges with regard to the stop and frisk program and what happened when that data became available. There's a lot of questions of who's looking at the data, and this is where I actually think that another actor in this, which is really your institution, is where does journalism come into this as asking the hard questions back to a lot of the data issues that are emerging. And I'm actually excited to see that there's a lot of new data journalism conversations happening, because I think that journalism is a discipline or a practice that is really about asking questions. And that's where I think it's really about bringing them all together.
And Marjorie, can I raise a question based on what Dana's point there really quickly? So to the audience, I'd be curious to know where we draw that line between training data scientists and training the public. Because I think one of the things Dana's getting at here that's really great is, do we have a responsibility to be educated as consumers of these results in order to know what was missing in that analysis or what did happen when that graph got built? Or just as a practitioner, like when my scale is tweeting my weight and if my watch is recording my heart rate, do I need an in-house data scientist to understand if I'm healthy? And it reminds me a bit of the monks' pre-literacy, right? Where the monks were the ones who understood all of the words, to go to them to read until, of course, we taught everyone to. And so I'm curious to the people in this room who might be able to make a difference there, where do we draw that line? Is it in the universities, high schools, or is this just a basic need as almost a civil right?
That's great. Well, not to be outdone by the academics, the previous panel, we're going to finish on time as well. So thank you very much for, if we could have a round of applause for our panel.